The radio at England's RAF Leiston shouldn't have been picking up anything. It should have been a dead frequency. Through the static, however, the American pilot of the 357th Fighter Group heard something strange. It was a voice from the abyss, cultured, British, chillingly evil, speaking directly to them. The Yoxford Boys, the voice sneeringly christened the pilots. Taunting, dismissive, the hacked transmission assured them they would never match the real men of Nazi Germany's mighty Luftwaffe. Yet the voice had just made a fatal miscalculation. Boys they may have been, yet these Americans brought with them a powerful new weapon. And now they had a name that the Nazis would never forget. A rocky start. A product of the U.S. Army Air Force's massive expansion following the nation's entry into World War II, the 357th Fighter Group was activated at Hamilton Field, California on December 1, 1942, and was assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Loring Stetson Jr. shortly afterwards. It was made up of the 362nd, 363rd, and 364th Flight Squadrons. However, training had barely begun when the fledgling unit's young pilots found themselves facing their first enemy. Not the Germans, nor the Japanese, but their own aircraft. The Bell P-39 Airacobra was supposed to be the United States frontline fighter. Yet, at the high altitudes of Tonopah Army Airfield in the Nevada desert, where the 357th was preparing for war, the Allison-powered aircraft posed tremendous risk to the group's airmen. The thin desert air caused the engine to struggle, and the P-39 had a vicious tendency to stall without warning, sending inexperienced aviators into unrecoverable spins. Every flight was a gamble for pilots like Leonard Kit Carson, John England, Richard Pete Peterson, and Chuck Yeager, fresh from flight school with barely 200 hours in their logbooks. They were learning to fly a temperamental fighter while mastering formation flying, aerial gunnery, and combat tactics. The margin for error was razor thin. To make matters worse, the conditions at Tonopah were as unforgiving as the aircraft. The 357th's personnel lived and worked in what one pilot described as, quote, tar paper shacks with no proper hangars for maintenance. Desert wind whipped sand through every crack, and temperatures swung from scorching days to freezing nights. With the tough environment compounding the technical issues, accidents were unsurprisingly commonplace. 3 pilots and a flight surgeon lost their lives in training accidents during their time in Nevada, including 364th Fighter Squadron Commander Captain Varian White, one of the few airmen with real combat experience, having seen action in the Philippines earlier in the war. However, a move to Santa Rosa Army Airfield in California did little to improve the situation. On July 7, 1943, tragedy struck again when 2 P-39s collided in midair, claiming the lives of both pilots, including Captain Clay Davis, commander of the 363rd Fighter Squadron. That same day, Lieutenant Colonel Stetson relinquished command of the group, which Chuck Yeager claimed was directly related to the unit's embarrassingly high fatality rate. Even under new commander, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin S. Chickering, further accidents occurred. By the time they were declared ready for overseas deployment in October 1943, through additional bases at Oroville, Pocatello, Casper, and Ainsworth, a total of 14 men had lost their lives in P-39 training incidents, while numerous aircraft had been lost or heavily damaged in additional non-fatal accidents. But those who survived this brutal apprenticeship had been forged by tragedy into something far more resilient than anyone could have imagined. The Yoxford Boys. In November 1943, the survivors of the 357th Fighter Group's training boarded the RMS Queen Elizabeth in New York Harbor. The massive liner, stripped of its peacetime luxury and packed with servicemen, carried them across the U-boat-infested Atlantic to their new home at RAF Raiden in Suffolk, England. The group had been allocated to the 9th Air Force as a P-51 Tactical Air Support Unit, but they arrived to find a critical shortage of aircraft. By the end of December, they had received just 15 Mustangs, barely enough for the squadron commanders to learn their new fighter, let alone train their pilots. However, the strategic situation was rapidly changing. The urgent need for long-range escort fighters capable of protecting bombers deep into Germany had resulted in a critical decision. The 8th Air Force would receive priority for P-51 Mustangs. In late January 1944, the 357th was reassigned from the 9th to the 8th Air Force in exchange for a P-47 group that had already begun combat operations. On January 31st, the group packed up and moved to their permanent wartime home, RAF Leiston on the Suffolk coast. A collection of Nissan huts and concrete runways carved from the English countryside, Station 373 would be their base for the next year and a half. The presence of a new American Mustang group in the 8th Air Force did not escape the attention of the Nazi propaganda machine. During one of his radio broadcasts, the British trader William Joyce, better known as the infamous Lord Hee-Haw, began referring to the group as the Yoxford Boys, a reference to a small village that was actually farther from their base than other nearby towns. Yet the nickname had a ring to it, and the group adopted it as their own. The German propagandist had inadvertently given them the moniker they would carry to glory. Shortly after their arrival at Leiston, the 357th finally received a full inventory of P-51B fighters. The sleek, liquid-cooled Mustang was a revelation after the troublesome P-39. Powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, it was significantly faster, more lethal, and more reliable than the P-39. The timing could not have been more perfect. The Yoxford Boys were about to become the first P-51 Mustang unit in the 8th Air Force. The Big Week. On February 11, 1944, the 357th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission, a bomber escort to V-1 sites in the Pas-de-Calais, led by Medal of Honor recipient Major James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group. Similar missions took place over the following 2 days. However, on February 17th, there would be another change of leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Chickering was assigned to a staff position with the 9th Air Force, and command of the 357th was taken over by Colonel Henry Spicer. The group's baptism of fire would come just 3 days later, during Operation Argument, later known as the Big Week. Beginning on February 20th, this was the most ambitious bombing campaign against Nazi Germany yet. A sustained, coordinated attack on the Luftwaffe's fighter production facilities designed to cripple its ability to defend the Reich. The Yoxford Boys would escort bomber formations deep into German airspace, facing fierce resistance from experienced Luftwaffe pilots defending their homeland's industrial heart. The green American pilots would suddenly find themselves thrust into massive aerial battles involving hundreds of aircraft. Yet they soon proved they were up to the challenge. On the first day of the campaign, Lieutenant Calvert Williams of the 362nd Squadron made history by scoring the 357th Fighter Group's very first aerial victory, downing a Messerschmitt Bf-109 with his Mustang, nicknamed Wee Willie. As the swirling dogfights continued in the skies above central Germany over the next 4 days, he would be joined on the scoreboard by several other members of the group. By the end of the Big Week, the 357th had downed 22 enemy aircraft. While they also lost 8 of their own Mustangs and their pilots, the Yoxford Boys had demonstrated that young American aviators with just weeks of combat experience could hold their own against veteran German airmen. Into the lion's den. The confidence gained during the Big Week would be tested almost immediately. On March 5th, during an escort mission to Bordeaux, France, the 357th suffered a devastating blow when Colonel Spicer was shot down and captured after less than 3 weeks in command, spending the rest of the war as a POW. In the same engagement, Flight Officer Chuck Yeager was also downed, but managed to evade capture with help from the French resistance, spending 25 days behind enemy lines before reaching Spain. Colonel Donald Graham quickly took over command of the group, inheriting a unit that had been bloodied but was rapidly gaining experience. Just 1 day later, on March 6th, Graham would lead the Yoxford Boys on one of the most significant missions in the history of strategic bombing, the first American daylight raid on Berlin. The attack on the German capital represented everything the P-51 Mustang had been designed for. No other Allied fighter possessed the range to escort bombers to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,100 miles. The 357th's mission got off to a shaky start when Graham was forced to abort due to mechanical problems, leaving Major Tommy Hayes of the 364th Squadron to lead the group into the heart of the Third Reich. Navigation proved treacherous, with the continent completely sucked in by clouds. At the designated rendezvous time, Hayes broke radio silence, asking Captain William O'Brien, quote, "Where's Berlin, Obie?" O'Brien responded, quote, "I think Berlin's behind us." The group executed a 180-degree turn within an opening in the clouds, and just as it completed the maneuver, the bombers broke out of the clouds 7 miles away. Before anyone could celebrate the near-perfect rendezvous, another voice broke in, quote, "Bogies, 2 and 3 o'clock level." More than 100 German aircraft were heading for the bombers, Bf-110s, Me-410s, and Bf-109s in a massive defensive formation. Captain O'Brien latched onto a Bf-110, sending its left engine area up in flames before it dived vertically and smashed into an industrial building below. O'Brien would later say, quote, "You never saw such a fine explosion." When the smoke cleared, the scoreboard told an incredible story. The 357th was credited with 20 German fighters destroyed over Berlin without losing a single aircraft. It was their first perfect day, and proof that they could now match Germany's best pilots over their own capital. Clobber College. As spring 1944 progressed, the 357th Fighter Group was rapidly accumulating both victories and experience. On March 16th, both Captain Jack Warren and Lieutenant John Carter downed their 5th aircraft, becoming the group's first aces, though Warren would tragically go missing in action 2 days later. What set the 357th apart from other units was its systematic approach to sharing knowledge and improving tactics. At the heart of this learning culture was Captain Kit Carson's innovative combat school, which Pilot nicknamed Clobber College. Carson, who had shown natural leadership abilities since his early days at Tonopah, recognized that survival in aerial combat depended on more than individual skill. It required pilots to learn from each encounter and share that knowledge with their squadron mates. Every mission debriefing became a classroom session, with Carson analyzing what had worked, what hadn't, and how tactics could be improved. The informal academy covered everything from aircraft recognition to deflection shooting, from formation flying to escape maneuvers. Carson would set up mock dogfights, teaching newer pilots how to use the P-51's strengths against German fighters. He would tell them, quote, "Never turn with a 109. Use your speed, climb away, then come back with an advantage." The lessons were paying off. On April 11th, the group demonstrated their growing proficiency in spectacular fashion, destroying 25 German aircraft in a single mission. Lieutenant Fletcher Adams found himself in a turning fight with a Bf-109, firing bursts while darting through the clouds. When he shot down his target and saw the pilot bail out, Adams spotted another aircraft approaching from behind. Thinking it was his wingman, he was shocked when it opened fire. His training took over. He went into evasive action at 20 feet, pulled up sharply, and watched as the German fighter attempted to follow his maneuver, but instead went spinning earthbound before exploding in a ball of fire. Captain Bud Anderson's flight spotted a Henkel HE-111 flying extremely close to the ground. Working as a coordinated team, just as Carson had taught them, each pilot took turns attacking the bomber until it crash-landed in flames. The crew jumped out, but their aircraft was destroyed. The lessons of Clobber College were transforming individual fighters into a lethal collective force. More aces emerge. The group's reputation was spreading throughout the 8th Air Force. Their aggressive tactics and growing expertise had made them one of the most effective fighter units in the theater, but individual rivalries were beginning to emerge as pilots competed for victories. The friendly competition drove everyone to higher levels of performance. By April 19th, Major Tommy Hayes had achieved ace status when he shot down a Bf-109 near Cassel for his 5th victory. But Hayes was just one of several pilots reaching this milestone as the Yoxford Boys entered what would become their most productive period. John England of the 362nd Squadron was rapidly climbing the scoreboard. After shooting down his first enemy aircraft on March 8th, he'd quickly added more victories to his tally. By late spring, England had emerged as one of the group's most consistent performers with his precise flying and accurate shooting. Pete Peterson was also making his mark, though his approach differed from England's measured style. Peterson flew with an intensity that bordered on recklessness, but his skill kept him alive, while his aggressiveness brought results. His P-51, called Hurry Home Honey, named after his wife's letter closings, became a familiar sight over German airspace. The moral complexities of air combat weighed heavily on some pilots. Peterson experienced this firsthand when he witnessed a German fighter shooting at American parachutists. His response, pursuing and eliminating the German pilot as he descended in his own parachute, illustrated the brutal realities that young American pilots faced. Meanwhile, Major Robert Foy was developing his own reputation as one of the group's most tenacious pilots. On June 29th, while leading a flight over Leipzig, Foy found himself in a Luftwaffe circle with several German fighters. Despite having most of his guns jam, he continued the fight with whatever weapons remained functional, eventually shooting down multiple enemy aircraft in a display of determination that earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross. Jaeger takes 5. As fall 1944 arrived, the Yoxford Boys' combination of experienced pilots, refined tactics, and technological advantages had transformed them into the 8th Air Force's most feared fighter unit. But the Luftwaffe still had fight left, often concentrating large numbers of fighters for massive interceptions in its desperate attempts to defend the Reich. On October 12th, First Lieutenant Chuck Yeager was leading the entire 357th Fighter Group on a bomber escort mission to Bremen, Germany. As one of the most experienced pilots in the group, Yeager had been given the responsibility of leading all 3 squadrons while they patrolled 50 to 100 miles ahead of the B-24 bombers they were protecting. At 25,000 feet over Steinhuder Lake, northwest of Hanover, Yeager spotted them. 22 Messerschmitt Bf-109s crossing in front of his squadron. The German fighters were at the same altitude, about 1.5 miles away, and Yeager was perfectly positioned, coming out of the sun with the tactical advantage. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable individual performances in the history of aerial warfare. Yeager positioned his 16 Mustangs behind the entire German formation and began to close the distance. As he approached 2 Bf-109s lagging to the right, something almost comic occurred. One German pilot suddenly slowed up and rolled over, bailing out before Yeager could even fire. His wingman immediately followed suit, abandoning his aircraft as well. Yeager had scored 2 victories without firing a shot, but he was just getting started. Dropping his wing tanks, Yeager closed on the rear of the German formation and opened fire from 600 yards using his K-14 gyroscopic gun sight. His bullets struck all over the enemy aircraft, particularly heavy in the cockpit area. The Bf-109 skidded left and began to smoke before spinning earthward. The wild dogfight that followed saw Yeager systematically destroy 2 more German fighters with devastating precision. In one engagement, he closed to just 100 yards and fired a 2-second burst that caused the entire fuselage to split open and explode. In another, he maneuvered behind a Bf-109 that was trying to get on his tail, pulling 6 Gs in the tight turn before scoring hits that caused the German pilot to bail out at 18,000 feet. When the smoke cleared, Yeager had destroyed 5 enemy fighters in a single mission, the 357th's first ace in a day, entering the exclusive ranks of only 38 USAAF pilots to accomplish this feat in World War II. He would be joined the following month by Kit Carson, who downed 5 FW-190s over Magdeburg, Germany on November 27th. The impossible day. By 1945, the Yoxford Boys had been flying combat missions for nearly a year, but January 14th would test their skills like never before. Lieutenant Colonel Erwin H. Dregney, who had taken over command of the fighter group a month earlier, led 66 Mustangs from Leiston in what appeared to be a routine escort mission, protecting 3rd Air Division B-17s, attacking oil installations near Berlin. The 357th employed their proven tactical formation. The 364th Squadron flew ahead of the bombers at 26,000 feet. The 362nd provided close escort over the lead formation, while the 363rd flew farther back at higher altitude. It was a formation they had refined through months of combat, designed to provide overlapping protection for the vulnerable bombers. Near Brandenburg, Captain Kit Carson spotted them first, contrails of what appeared to be an enormous German fighter formation approaching from the southeast. As the distant aircraft grew larger, the scope of what they were facing became clear. More than 200 German fighters were converging on the bomber stream in the largest Luftwaffe interception the 357th had ever encountered. The German formation was unlike anything they'd seen before. Heavily armored Focke-Wulf FW-190s flew in tight company front formations of 8 abreast, the infamous Sturmgruppen, specially designed to destroy bombers. Meanwhile, a protective screen of 100 Messerschmitt Bf-109s provided top cover at 32,000 feet. The Luftwaffe was clearly committing everything it had left to this single massive onslaught. The 364th Squadron struck first, breaking up the Sturmgruppen formations before they could reach the bombers. The trailing 363rd Squadron pursued the scattered German fighters, while the Bf-109s dove down to intervene, only to be intercepted by the 362nd Squadron and quickly reinforced by the 364th. In the swirling melee, the The months of training and combat experience paid off in spectacular fashion. Chuck Yeager and John England each claimed 4 victories, while Kit Carson and Group Commander Lieutenant Colonel Dregney scored 3 apiece. When the surviving German fighters fled toward home, the Yoxford Boys had achieved the impossible. 56.5 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single mission, the largest single-day victory total in 8th Air Force history. For this impressive achievement, they would be awarded a Distinguished Unit citation. A new enemy. On November 6, 1944, Chuck Yeager was patrolling the skies over Germany when he spotted something that made him look twice. A lone aircraft was approaching an airfield from the south at 500 feet, but its silhouette was like nothing he'd ever seen before. The wings were swept back at an unusual angle, the fuselage sleek and narrow, like nothing he'd ever encountered. But most shocking of all, there were no propellers. Instead of the familiar spinning blades and bulky engine cowlings that characterized every fighter he'd faced, 2 smooth, streamlined pods hung beneath the wings. It looked like something from another world entirely. Yeager had stumbled upon the Luftwaffe's most closely guarded secret, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. If the Germans had solved the puzzle of jet propulsion and were fielding these revolutionary aircraft in numbers, the entire balance of the air war could shift overnight. But, advanced or not, the strange aircraft was vulnerable at this moment. Flying at only 200 miles per hour on what appeared to be a landing approach, it presented a target that Yeager's conventional Mustang could engage. The jet pilot seemed unaware of the American fighter diving toward him from above. Yeager split S from altitude and dove at over 500 miles per hour, but accurate flak immediately erupted around his aircraft. German gunners were clearly protecting their prized technology. Forced to fire a hasty burst from 400 yards before breaking away from the ground fire, Yeager watched as his bullets found their mark. The Me-262's wing was damaged, and Yeager saw it crash short of the runway in a shower of sparks and debris. The 357th Fighter Group had scored its first victory over a jet aircraft. An impressive tally. By April 1945, the war in Europe was rapidly drawing to a close. The Yoxford Boys flew their final combat mission on April 25th, just 2 weeks before Germany's surrender. When the guns fell silent on May 8, 1945, the 357th Fighter Group's remarkable combat record was complete. 595.5 aerial victories and 106.5 aircraft destroyed on the ground, the highest total among all P-51 groups in the 8th Air Force. The 357th had produced 42 aces, more than any other fighter group in the European theater. In addition, they'd claimed 18.5 jet aircraft destroyed, more than any other Allied unit. Most remarkably, they had achieved all of this in just 14 months of combat operations, making them the fastest scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force. Nonetheless, the human cost for the 357th had been significant, with 60 of the group's pilots losing their lives or going missing in action. Meanwhile, for those who survived, the war's end brought different paths. Chuck Yeager would go on to break the sound barrier in 1947, becoming perhaps the most famous test pilot in history. Kit Carson continued his Air Force career, eventually retiring as a colonel and writing his memoir, Pursue and Destroy. John England remained in service, going on to fight in the Korean War, but tragically lost his life in a 1954 training accident with England Air Force Base named in his honor. Others found success in civilian life. Pete Peterson became an architect, while many former pilots entered careers in aviation, business, and education. The 357th Fighter Group had proven that with the right combination of aircraft, tactics, and determination, even the newest units could dominate the skies. Their legacy would inspire generations of American airmen who followed, setting a standard of excellence that few would ever match. The name Lord Hee-Haw had given them in mockery had become a symbol of aerial supremacy. The Yoxford Boys had earned their place in history.